Good morning everyone. Today we are diving into Chapter 2 of our text, World Trade, an Overview. This chapter is divided into 5 key areas. First, we'll identify the major players by looking at the largest trading partners of the US. Then, we'll introduce the gravity model, which examines how an economy's size and geographic distance determine trade flow. We will also compare globalization through a historical lens, comparing the past to the present, and analyze how the types of goods we trade have shifted toward manufactured products. And finally, we'll discuss the modern rise of service outsourcing. Now, let's look at the actual data behind the question, who trades with whom? To understand the scale we are talking about, consider that as of 2015, more than 30% of total world output is sold across national borders. This means that about 1 out of every $3 of value created globally is part of international trade. When we look specifically at the United States, we see some very clear patterns. Back in 2012, the top 5 U.S. trading partners were Canada, China, Mexico, Japan, and Germany. If you look at this list, you'll notice something interesting that we will explore more with the gravity model. Canada and Mexico are U.S. immediate neighbors, while China, Japan, and Germany are some of the largest economies in the world. This tells us that distance and size are the 2 most important factors in trade. Even though there are nearly 200 countries in the world, the US trades the most with Canada and Mexico simply because they are physically closest. Shorter distances mean lower transport costs, trucks and trains instead of ships. Faster delivery times, more integrated supply chains. Finally, notice how concentrated this trade is. The top 15 partners alone accounted for 69%, nearly 7/10, of the total value of US trade. This shows us that while the global market is huge, the bulk of the action happens between a relatively small group of major economic players. Looking at Figure 2:1, we see a clear visual ranking of who the US trades with. If we apply the gravity model we just discussed, this chart makes perfect sense. First, notice Canada and Mexico. They are the largest bars on the chart. Even though they aren't the largest economies in the world, their physical proximity, sharing a border, makes them the US's most natural trading partners. Second, look at China. Despite the vast Pacific Ocean separating it from the US, it sits at number 2. This is because of China's immense economic mass. Its huge GDP creates a powerful gravitational pull that outweighs the cost of shipping goods across the ocean. Finally, look at how quickly the bars shorten. After the top 15 countries, trade volume becomes relatively small. This shows that the global economy is highly concentrated. Most of the action happens between a few giant or very close neighbors. Now, let's look at more recent data from 2020. This slide is a great comparison to the 2012 data we saw earlier. First, look at the very top. Mexico has moved into the number 1 spot. Together with Canada, these 2 neighbors account for over 28% of all US trade. This is the strongest evidence possible for the distance component of the gravity model. Trading across a land border is simply more efficient. Second, notice the composition of these bars. If you look at China, the light blue section, which represents imports into the US, is much larger than the dark blue export section. This highlights the trade deficit that is often discussed in global news. Finally, look at the percentages on the right. The top 3 partners alone account for nearly 42% of all US trade. By the time we get down to Vietnam at the bottom of this list, the share is only 2.3%. This slide confirms that even as years pass and global politics change, the fundamental laws of size and distance continue to dictate who the world's major trading partners are. To make these concepts more relevant to us here in Malaysia, let's look at Malaysia's own trading partners using data from MATRADE. This table perfectly mirrors the patterns we saw in the US data. Look at our top 2 partners, the United States and Singapore. This is the gravity model in action. Singapore is at the top because it is our closest neighbor, proving that distance is a major factor. The US is at the top because of its massive economic size, proving that a large GDP can overcome even the greatest distances. We also see strong trade with Thailand and Indonesia. Again, these are our regional neighbors. By trading heavily with our fellow ASEAN members, we reduce shipping times and costs. Finally, notice the others category at the bottom. Only 27.5% of our trade is done with the rest of the world outside of these top 10. This confirms the rule we've been discussing. Global trade is not random. It is a predictable system driven by how big an economy is and how close it is to its partners. To bring our discussion back to a local context, let's look at what Malaysia actually buys from the United States. In 2020, our agricultural imports from the US totaled $1.1 billion. If you look at the categories listed here, you'll see a clear pattern. Our biggest import is soybeans, at $240 million, followed by dairy products and food preparations. This data is important for two reasons. First, it shows that even though Malaysia and the US are thousands of miles apart, the economic size of the US makes it a vital supplier for our food security. Second, it illustrates the composition of trade. We aren't just trading finished consumer goods, we are trading input commodities like cotton and wheat that are essential for our local industries to function. This slide is a perfect example of how international trade directly affects the products we see on our supermarket shelves right here in Sabah. After seeing what we buy from the US, let's look at what the United States buys from Malaysia. Interestingly, the value is identical at $1.1 billion, showing a very balanced exchange. However, the nature of the products is completely different. While we buy temperate crops like wheat and soy from them, the US relies on Malaysia for tropical agricultural products. Nearly half of this value, $490 million, comes from vegetable oils, primarily our palm oil. We also see a high volume of industrial alcohols and fatty acids, which are essential inputs for the American chemical and cosmetic industries. What is most impressive here is the bottom of the list, baked goods and pasta. This proves that Malaysia is moving up the value chain. We aren't just selling raw oil, we are selling finished, processed foods to one of the most competitive markets in the world. This is a perfect example of how global trade allows nations to focus on what they produce best and trade for the rest. To conclude our empirical overview, let's look at this comprehensive chart of Malaysia's trade from 2018. This butterfly chart shows our exports on the left and our imports on the right. The first thing to notice is the sheer dominance of our regional partners. ASEAN and China together account for nearly half of all our trade activities. This perfectly validates the gravity model. We trade the most with those who are physically closest to us and those who have the largest economic mass. If you compare the two sides, you'll see that Malaysia is in a healthy position. Our total exports of 568 billion ringgit exceed our imports of 499 billion. Look at the USA's position. It remains a vital, long-distance partner because of its size, but notice how we are highly integrated with our Asian neighbors like Japan, Taiwan, and South Korea. This regional concentration is exactly what trade theory predicts. Distance creates friction through transport costs, so we naturally gravitate toward the giants in our own backyard. Now we move to a core pillar of the gravity model, economic size. If we look at Europe, the US trades most with Germany, the UK, and France. Why these three? Quite simply, because they have the largest gross domestic product, GDP, in the region. The data shows a nearly perfect correlation. A country's share of trade with the US is almost exactly equal to its share of total European GDP. This confirms that size matters. Large economies produce more to sell and have more income to buy, making them natural magnets for international trade. If the previous slides showed us data, this slide shows us the law of economics. Figure 2:2 plots the size of European economies against their trade value with the United States. The diagonal line you see is the most important part of this chart. Notice how the dots for Germany, the UK, and France sit almost perfectly along this line. This proves the first half of the gravity model. Economic size is the primary driver of trade. Essentially, a country's share of US trade is almost exactly equal to its share of total European GDP. Whether an economy is a giant like Germany or a smaller player like Sweden, its position on this graph tells the same story. The more a country produces and earns, the more it engages with the global market. This scatter plot confirms that the gravity of an economy's size is a real, measurable force in international trade. The size of an economy is directly related to the volume of imports and exports. Larger economies produce more goods and services, so they have more to sell in the export market. Larger economies generate more income from the goods and services sold, so they are able to buy more imports. Trade between any two countries is larger, the larger is either country. The final takeaway here is the golden rule of the gravity model. Trade between any two nations increases if the size of either country increases. This explains why the global trade landscape is so heavily dominated by Goliaths, like the US and China. Their massive economic mass creates a gravitational pull that is simply impossible for smaller nations to ignore. Alright class, I have a quick exercise for you as a refreshment. Based on what we have just discussed, what is the definition of the gravity model? Please post your answers in the comment section. Make sure your full name is clearly identified so I can record your participation. Let's look into the equation. T represents the total value of trade between two countries. This value is calculated by taking a constant, A, and multiplying it by Y and Y, which are the GDPs of the two nations. Finally, we divide that total by D, which is the distance between them. This shows us that while a higher GDP increases trade, a greater distance decreases it.